Everything bass. How's everybody doing? This is Maurice in Los Angeles. Outside warming up on my Moulin P bass, and it feels great, weather and bass. Hey, this week we're talking about our tone and how do we describe our tone. And my tone is what I would describe the classic Fender sound. I grew up on those records and those recordings, and that's reference bass for me. And I've had a lot of basses in my lifetime. And I've learned that this is the sound that pleases me the most. Fender P basses and Fender Jazz basses, or instruments inspired by that. I think Sadowski does an amazing job. Mike Lull does as well. R.I.P. And the amps I use right now are Aguilar, and I'm very happy with that. Used to be with Ashdown, and I think those are amazing sounding amps as well. And I think I think both products are great. But Aguilar right now is my go-to jam, and I love their tone hammers and their AG700 amp and their SL cabinets. They sound great. I did have I had an awakening when I went to music school, Musicians Institute. I remember so easy to blame gear for bad tone and bad sound. And we'd go into our labs and things, and we'd plug up into these old PV amps when I went to school. And you couldn't get a good tone, or you thought you couldn't get a good tone. And I remember then a teacher would come in, somebody like Dave Keif or Alexis Sklereski, and they would plug up and they wouldn't even turn a knob, and all of a sudden it would just sound amazing. It's like, what did you just do? And you realize the tone, the start of good tone comes from the hands. And that's good technique and understanding how to finesse the strings and open notes and fretted notes, and that's really important. And if tone matters to you, and if you're working, tone should matter to you. But those are the lessons I've learned from being around other players. I mean, I listed a bunch of gear at the beginning of this discussion, but it really comes down to the hands and the player that you are, and how to make your musical expression come out as you're hoping it does. As far as great sounds out there in recordings, I remember I used to bring China Girl from David Bowie, and Gail Ann Dorsey's the bassist on there, and I just thought that was sort of my very target for bass sound. It's not popping out like a Marcus Miller, which I think has a great tone, but it just sat in the mix really well, and I really thought that recording of her bass was something that I was trying to get for myself. So that's the one that comes to mind right now. Of course, the world is loaded with great bassists and their sounds, and there's days where I'm like in a Jocko mood, and you're putting everything on the bridge pickup, and then there's days where I just love like a Geezer Butler kind of overdriven, thuddy, just driving kind of loud bass. And all those have their place and their use. So have fun with it, man. Dialing in tone. I'm a gearhead, so it's kind of fun to play around with that. And every room that you move your gear to is different, and you got to do some adjustments. Know what a flat setting is, and start with that. And I usually don't have to tweak too much on an EQ if your bass is dialed in right and your pickups are not too close to your strings and things like that. But those are my takes on tone and the loveliness of this instrument that we play. So I hope that helped, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Take care. Bye.
Hey everyone, we're talking about tone today. This is Dave Keif, and I imagine all of us are going to say more or less the same thing, which is about the hands mostly. Fretting hand, picking hand, they both contribute to the tone immensely. On the fretting hand, you need good technique so you're not getting lots of slop and stuff that you don't want in your sound. And the picking hand has to be solid and has to attack the bass the way you want it to. And where you position it between the fretboard and the bridge contributes a lot to what kind of sound you get. Move it up toward the fretboard, you're going to get a round sound, maybe for jazz or ballads or something where you want a big tone. Move it back, you're going to get a little more bite, a little more mid-range to cut through the band. So it took me a long time to get where I was developing really strong opinions about tone and how to get them. I started off just playing a lot of gigs with my father and his friends, and I was just trying to survive. So it's a combination of your hands mostly, what kind of pickup configuration you have on your bass and how you're using them. I play a lot of jazz bass style basses, so it's mostly I use most pickups on all the time. And of course, your amp and your speaker sizes and all that, it all contributes. So you need to consider all of it when you start thinking about tone. I generally go for flat EQs across the board on the bass and on the amp until I really need something. I recommend you don't over accentuate bottom or top end, which can either get rumbly or really clanky. So listen to the people you admire on records and live and start to develop your own sound. It takes a long time, but it can happen if you start thinking about it now. So good luck, and we'll talk again. Thanks. Bye.
Hello, everyone. This week I was very curious, and I am greatly looking forward to the responses of my fellow panelists. What makes you different? There are more people who play a musical instrument now than perhaps there has ever been. And all the notes are the same. Everything, like what Victor Wooten said, when I bought my bass, I bought all the same notes that Jocko had, but I didn't sound like Jocko. So for me, I do take inspiration. I have my favorites in terms of bass players that I listen to regularly, but what I'm about to say is going to sound very pretentious, but I mean it from the most humble part of me. I could never sound like Stu Hamm, and Stu Hamm could never sound like me. We can play the same lines, but it's his personality comes through his playing. My personality, such as it is, comes through my playing. And what I hear in my head is a clear, clean, sharp, distinct tone, where the lows are round and full and the highs just cut through. So I'm taking that from a plethora of musicians, mainly pianists. Piano is by far my favorite instrument. It is not my instrument, but I love the sound of it. Nothing in the whole world sounds like a beautiful grand piano. And so I have lots of gear, mostly as a part of my bass. I'm trying to get the initial sound of the unplugged acoustic instrument the best that it can be, so that when I amplify it, I'm amplifying a great sound and a great tone. But yeah, for me, I'm always going to be chasing the sound that I have in my head. And I can play other, I can play styles, I can play other tones, but that's the one that's really mine. When I get the chance to play my way, or be myself, that's the tone that's going to come through, is sharp and clear and round and all those other things that I just mentioned. And so tone is always going to be a difficult and divisive topic, but what makes you stand out? For me, I'm happy to stand still and stand in the background, but I want my bass to be singing and dancing and doing its job instead of me acting like a clown. I know a few people who put on a great show, and the acrobatics are part of the act. Then I've also seen people that are just acting like a fool, and that's not me. I'm not a big show person, but I love the ability to stand there and just make a song kind of lift. I'm supplying the foundation, and then everyone else is able to sit on it, and then I'm also able to interact with the other musicians. That's just what I love doing. That's my answer, and like I said, I'm so very much intrigued and interested in what everyone else will say. Everyone, please stay safe and have just the best weekend you can, and I'll see you next time.
Hello everyone, this is Mark Corradetti coming to you from my home in Sarasota, Florida. This week's question was very interesting. Is the sound that you hear in your head one that you can reproduce, and how have you done it? I don't think it's a very conscious thing. I think the main thing is when you start to write music and you start to compose your own parts and things with all the vocabulary that you've learned all over the years, you tend to you start to make your own choices rather than just copying other people's choices. As far as the actual tone, I keep my amp flat, and the bass always feels good in my hands. It's properly set up and feels good to me. I think that's got a lot to do with it. If I feel good, I play good. If I feel bad, I don't play so good. So I try to feel good most of the time. I think that just comes with time and effort and listening and influences and things like that. I think that's probably my best answer so far. But good question. So have a great weekend and enjoy. Bye-bye.
Hey Bass Chat family, Roy Vogt coming to you from his music room and home studio outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And the question this week is, what is your ideal bass tone? And the answer is, well, it depends on the decade. In 1970, when I first got my first bass, this was my ideal bass tone. Needless to say, I was a big Jack Bruce fan, and so that was where I was going after. Now, what happened is that different circumstances brought different sounds in my life. So my ideal bass tone changed to this one in a second. We're going to be switching a lot of basses. I brought a lot of visual aids. So, right after that, and I wish I had the original basses, but you can't keep them all, You really can't keep them all. So the next ideal bass tone for me was because of my instructor and mentor, Ed Garcia, and I was going to North Texas State, getting ready to get in the jazz program, and he looked at, I think by then I had a Guild bass, and he was like, no, you got to get a Fender. And so I got this freakish Fender Franken bass, and I'll put the picture in. You can see the picture here while I'm wiring this up. And this is just a passive PJ, a later one. This is a Carvin pre-Kiesel Carvin PJ, and I'm just running it passively. But for a long time, my ideal bass tone was this. So I really like just a passive precision pickup. This bass that I had actually had two circuits that had a passive precision and a passive jazz pickup, and you could stereo wire it. And if anybody sees that bass out there that was stolen off an Air Florida flight, I'd love to get it back. But that was my ideal bass tone for the longest time. And then a guy from Philadelphia came along and kind of changed all of our ideal bass tones, and things were about ready to get a whole lot more expensive in my world. So here's the next one. Here's the next ideal bass tone from the mid to late 70s on into the 80s. For a long time, until I moved to Nashville, this was my ideal bass tone. This is a 1976 Alembic Series 1 that I got when I think I was 20. So This was my focus was really, on. Kind of the Stanley sound. And then later, when I discovered Jaco and Jeff Berlin, I said, well, how can I get that on this bass? And basically I learned how to use the Q switches and was able to dial in. That was my ideal late 80s tone, or excuse me, late 70s, early 80s tone. Needless to say, when you move to Nashville, that's not a popular tone. So you're going to have to go and change your perspective, and I did. So from there, I went back to this type of bass in the early 80s. So I was back to my PJ. Only this time I think I had a 66 Precision with the jazz pickup near it, and I apologize in advance for that, but basically that bass was refinished, and as we say, it had no collector's value, and it was kind of like, who knew? And I'm sorry about that. Those of you who are collectors and Fender aficionados, my apologies. So my next ideal tone was basically a Precision passive with a jazz pickup. And it had a little bit more sharpness to it, and so it was really useful. The problem with it is that with these basses, that with a P bass and a single coil, you're always going to get some hum, and you get real good at turning in your room, and real good at turning and finding the place where it's quiet. Now, there was a bit of a revolution that was getting ready to happen to bass guitars, and I was right in the thick of it in Nashville in the early 80s. I wish I had the original bass that I was using that was like this, but I don't have it. I have a later model. But the big next thing for me as far as my ideal tone happened about 1983, and I bought a Quantum 6, one of the very, very first Quantum 6s that Jeff Gould built. So it was the first bass that I'd ever had with a graphite neck, and this is a later one. This is a 93, but throughout most of the mid to late 80s, my tone was these basses, and so there's a real piano tone to these. Let me see if I can get that going. Oh, yeah. So it has a lot more top, a lot more bottom. Of course, it's an active bass. And of course, I had 5 and 6 strings. So these had this really classic, almost a piano sound. So that kept me working all the way through the 80s into the early 90s. In the early 90s, I changed companies, and so my ideal tone changed as well. And there's one setting on this which we'll revisit on this particular bass. So you'll see this one again. So mostly with the 2 pickup basses and with the actives, I was kind of doing a very balanced piano sound. So now the next tone idea I had for my ideal tone was this guy. This is a 1992 Carvin LB76. It's an active, basically a jazz bass. This is my oldest Carvin that I still have, that I still use, and it's a fretless. So one of the things you notice about it is, because of the smaller aperture of the jazz pickups, and because it's back to wood, it's poplar and maple and a little bit of a maple face, it's got this kind of... So it has this little bit of more high end, a little bit more hi-fi tone. Now, I'm not going through a bass amp. I'm going through my studio monitors, and I'm going through my PreSonus Studio Live 12 AR12C mixing console for my home studio. Yay, PreSonus. So anyway, yeah, this was my 90s sound, a lot of it, and this would have been some things that these were basses I was playing with Jerry Reed, and also later with Engelbert Humperdinck. So it's very precise, very defined, and it's a little more, it's got a little bit more focus to the tone compared to the previous one. Now, let's go back to the previous one, because I've had this long-term relationship with the folks at Carvin, now Kiesel. One of the really, really useful tones that I was getting out of this modulus bass, and this is 93, so I've had this one for a good long while, although, for me, that's relative, because that first bass you heard, my ideal tone in 1970, gosh, we're talking 51 years ago. A lot's changed. And the other thing that happens is, with a lot of this stuff, the instruments you're playing with change. So, the moduluses, I was probably playing a lot with Prophet 5s and with DX7s and all sorts of stuff, and it was very kind of digital and bright sounding. But one thing I noticed about this particular bass, when the majority of my work was recording work, and one of the things I noticed was that there was this really sweet spot as far as the pickups, and it was right in the middle, and that's essentially like two precision pickups. These soap bars here are wired like two precision pickups. And one of the things I started finding with, when I started working in the 2000s and beyond, was that everything old was new again. And a lot of the younger players were using basses like that old funky Kalamazoo I started with. And the fine people at Kiesel approached me about coming up with my own model, which was a signature bass. And essentially, pardon me, I'm going to step out of the frame for a second to get this. Essentially, my question was, what could I do that was unique and nobody else was doing in terms of basses? And also the other thing is, once again, I'm still doing a lot of recording work. What sounds good? And what I found, like I said, in that earlier modulus, was that precision type configuration of the coils worked better. So there it is. That's the Roy Vogt signature tone. A lot of times it's essentially like a precision bass. In this case, it's one with 6 strings. But a lot of times what I'll do with that, my favorite tone on this, with a band especially, is slightly more neck pickup than bridge pickup. And then right now, I'll make this thing totally flat. So that's very much like a precision bass. I know it doesn't look like one, but, on the track, It can sound like one, and especially I like a little bit of bridge pickup. So I'm still more inclined to use more front pickup of a P type than the back pickup. But yeah, that's my happy space. This is which, you know, if you're going to do a signature bass, you better be happy with it. That's what you need to be playing. So in this case, the fine people at Kiesel built this for me, and I've got a fretless one of these. And most of the time, if you see me doing any sort of a public event, I'm playing this bass or the fretless sister of this bass. And so yeah, that's my ideal bass tone. What it is sort of like mids are kind of the magical thing. One of the things I found out with hi-fi basses is you have a lot of top and a lot of bottom and you have no mids. And the minute that you start surrounding the bass with guitars and keyboards and you know, the sounds get big, the bass tends to go away. So the split precision type pickups seem to have a little bit more mid-range, and that, although it's not necessarily a very glamorous tone, is what works to support a band. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. That's my ideal bass tone. I am really lucky that I've had some wonderful companies like Modulus back in the 80s and Carvin since the 90s and now Kiesel that have helped me to realize and develop my tone. And once again, they've worked great for me. They're wonderful people. You know, this isn't a Kiesel commercial, but hey, they make great basses. If you're in the market, maybe check one out. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Stay safe, keep it low, and see you next week.
Hey, I'm Dale Titus here from Amador, California, getting out with my wife, just enjoying the beautiful weather. But I wanted to answer this question. So tone is a very complex thing, and this question asks many things about it. First of all, how would I describe my tone? Well, my tone, I like as clean a tone as possible. Slight boost in the bass, slight boost in treble, slight dip in the mids, nothing radical. But I love to have a lot of headroom, and again, clarity is important to me. I want my tone to be as clear as possible. That way, when I do add effects to it, I can really hear the true effect. And then tips on you getting your tone. Well, first of all, look who you admire. Look at the people, the bass players that really caught your attention, and you know, try to study them as much as possible. There's a lot of resources online now where you can find out not only the gear, but maybe see videos of them describing their playing. Realize this, the tone really does start with your hands. If you do like a very clean tone, but you have sloppy technique, you're gonna be disappointed. You know, looking at someone like Lemmy, who's an amazing player, was, you know, had that really wild picking technique, had that really crazy tone. You know, if you want to emulate his tone, you can't just buy his amps. You gotta look at the technique and apply that. So anyway, you know, spend time, you know, look at who you admire, really do some research, experiment, and have fun. Thanks for the question.